This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Everybody agrees that baseball once held, and may still hold, an almost religious pull on Americans' imaginations. But nobody agrees on how or why a mere game should have been so important to this nation for so long, not to mention whether or not that influence has been a good thing overall. Here's a skeptic's view of baseball's influence. Baseball's not only an American religion, it's the American way, representative of activities and a unique psychology worshipped by Americans. In its dogged competition of men set against one another, it represents the American capitalist system. It exemplifies the Horatio Alger myth, in that anyone can achieve fame and wealth. In its stylized version of men combating other men, it satisfies a nation's lust for, and guilt toward, war and power. But it also fulfills a primitive power lust, and its teams often have animal names or generic names of the hunt or conquest: tigers, giants, pirates, braves. Here's a spokesman, on the other hand, for the other side. Baseball is inexhaustible. In loving it, you are also loving many other things: summer, youth, skill, grace, camaraderie, courage, tradition, fair play, and whatever fragrances your own memory supplies. A key difference between baseball and democracy is that in baseball the winners don't get to rewrite the rules. And it never occurs to the losers to blame the rules for their losses. Our deepest norms of order can still be seen in operation on the diamond when they've been adulterated everywhere else. Baseball is our utopia, not in assuring us of the victories we dream of, but in guaranteeing ideal conditions, even of defeat. I'd like to talk to you today about the ways that the game of baseball has shaped and still shapes our mental life. There are three main ways that baseball, and not other sports like football, basketball, horse racing, boxing, or golf, emerged as the national pastime. In turn, they're through literature, through art, and through metaphor. Let's take the first. Baseball and writing have gone hand in hand from the start. The first baseball writers were journalists who prepared summaries of games for their newspapers, just as the first sports pages in American newspapers were created to publish the scores and accounts of baseball games. The first publication dedicated exclusively to baseball was called Beadle's Dime Baseball Player. It sold about 50,000 copies on the eve of the Civil War. In 1867, fans bought 65,000 copies of the Ball Player's Book of Reference. For comparison with these numbers, Uncle Tom's Cabin sold approximately 300,000 copies in 1852, a much larger number, but still in the same ballpark, so to speak. As for baseball's literary origins, they're modest enough. The earliest writers focused on boys' teams, mixing tales of sporting contests with themes of class friction and moral dilemmas. The hero of one such work, Charles Monroe Sheldon's short story called The Captain of the Orient Nine, the hero agonizes at length whether he should confess that his game-winning catch was trapped rather than caught before hitting the ground. If you think it's quaint to use sports stories to teach young people lessons in ethics, take a look at a Disney film, perhaps you've seen it, for young adults, called Brink, made in 1998. Brink, the title character, is a talented skateboarder who lives clean, trains hard, and unlike his opponent in the championship race, doesn't cheat to win. Using sports stories to teach children lessons in morality is an old custom. At the turn of the last century, Gilbert Paton began to publish stories about a fictional baseball player named Frank Merriwell. Frank was master of the double-shoot pitch. It curved first one way, then another. Paton was so successful with the Frank Merriweather books that he wrote more than 200 of them, with sales of more than 125 million copies about Merriwell's athletic activities. His hero was mainly, but not exclusively, a baseball player. And it's said, over all America, boys almost ruined their arms trying to throw balls that curved twice on the way to the plate. So influential were those books. Books like these were popular because of Americans' love of baseball, and in turn, books like these made baseball even more popular as the national pastime. A kind of synergy, you see, developed. In Everything Baseball, James Moore catalogs the many hundreds of movies, television shows, plays, songs, and poems that have been written over the years about our national game. The pictorial record of American art also conveys how thoroughly and for how long baseball has captured the national imagination. Visual artists have been creating some of the most endearing and revealing images of the game, even before Cartwright and the Knickerbockers set down its rules. Let's take a look at a representative sampling of this rich visual history. In this sequence of images, you can see the relationships between baseball and childhood, baseball and the American imagination being reflected and being forged. Painters sometimes saw a connection between baseball and politics, between baseball and everyday life, baseball and race equality, and of course baseball and heroism. As these images make clear, the story of baseball really is the story of America. First is a painting by an unknown artist called Boy with Bat and Ball. It dates from 1844. The next is by the well-known lithographers Currier and Ives. Theirs is called The National Game, 3 outs and 1 run, Abraham winning the ball game. You see there the political figures, chief of which would be Abraham Lincoln. In 1875, the well-known American artist Thomas Eakins painted a work he called Baseball Players Practicing. A few years later, in 1890, Douglas Tilden, a sculptor, created a work he called The Baseball Player. You see the heroic stature Tilden gives to his piece. John George Brown, another painter, there's no date for this one, entitled this work, Put It Here. You see the boy gesturing exactly where he wants the ball thrown. 1925, George Lux, another painter, created this version of a painting he called Boy with Baseball. The relatively new phenomenon in 1934, night baseball, this painting commemorating it was created by Morris Cantor, called Baseball at Night. A painting 5 years later by the artist Philip Evergood called The Early Youth of Babe Ruth, done in 1939. In 1953, Elaine de Kooning, an abstract expressionist painter, created a work she called Baseball Players. In 1960, Ernest Trova, a sculptor, but sometimes a painter, he created a series of images of baseballs. This is one of that series from 1960. Called Baseball. And the last in the sequence, in 1985, an artist named Andy Jarinko created a somewhat historic portrait of Brooklyn Dodger players. He called it Dodger Lumber. Jarinko was also noted for painting many images, some of them are quite lovely, of major league ballparks. If baseball's given us literature and art or painting, it's also shaped the way we speak and think. In a PhD dissertation written in 1939, Edward Nichols documented more than 2,500 words and expressions in American English that had their origins in baseball. Some of these have since gone out of use. It no longer makes sense to call a line drive a clothesline, mainly because we dry our laundry now by tumbling it in machines. We don't hang it on a line to dry in the sun. But a surprising number of the terms Nichols identified are still current. Think for a moment of all the expressions now in everyday use that derive from baseball. There are dozens and dozens of examples that American English borrows from baseball. To obtain an estimate, we ask for a ballpark figure. To substitute for somebody is to go to bat for him or her. You're performing a serious endeavor, or so Chris Matthews thinks, if you're playing hardball. To be off base is to be in error. However, getting to first base, or second, or third, and so on, has long carried specific sexual meanings. An idea that comes out in left field is any absurd notion, while a person who's out of his league is simply outclassed. And if for some reason your ticket to the movies can't be honored, you will get a rain check. Journalists sometimes give politicians they like softball questions, while they throw a curve to those they don't. And to set up an appointment for an interview, they may first touch base with a member of the staff. Why is this important? It's simple. To study the metaphors you use or a society uses is to explore deep inside your mind, its mind. The metaphors you use reveal the way you think and the way you understand the world. The same is true for a nation. Our metaphors teach us not only what we think about life, but how to think about it in the first place. When we use a metaphor, we substitute a figurative way of saying something for a more literal expression. As when, for example, if you feel discouraged, you might say, "I feel blue," instead of the more literal, "I feel sad." Whoever happens to be listening knows that you don't mean that you have suddenly acquired a new coloration, like kids used to enjoy when they were little watching a cartoon called The Smurfs where all the people were blue. But your listeners understand you're not now literally blue. Rather, they understand you to be describing a particular emotional state, one that's characterized, whether you know it or not, by feeling similar to the melancholy, depressed mood associated with a particular kind of music, the blues, that developed among Southern African American communities in the late 19th century. Why do we use language in this way? Why do we use figurative language? We do it habitually and usually unconsciously, mainly because this swerve to the figurative adjective blue allows us a much greater range of expressive possibilities than does the more straightforward expression sad. The metaphor gives your statement a superfluity of meaning. It packs more punch. It gives you more bang for your buck. In everyday conversation, we don't often notice figures of speech as common as these, but that doesn't mean they're not important to the way we live and think. In fact, the less we notice that we're using them, the more likely they are to be subtly making up our minds. Common metaphors like these are examples of what Steven Pinker of Harvard calls pedestrian poetry. In other words, baseball metaphors and many others like them aren't just frills we use to gussy up our speech. They're what linguists call reality structuring metaphors. They're crucial lenses through which we learn how to think and feel about our world. The metaphors are passed down and across generations, and in their passage through time they carry with them a culture's distinct shape and belief. We think, speak, and act in the ways that we do, in part, because of what baseball has given us. Playing or watching baseball may not teach you the meaning of life, but the game has surely given us some terms to help us make sense of it.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.